This prisoner on death row with 2 lives in his hands was about to be electrocuted, but the execution guards were all in tears. The order to execute was delayed. Faced with the rebuke of the victim's family, the warden could only say with tears in his eyes, when the electricity passed through the body of the dead prisoner, this angel on earth finally returned to the arms of God. Remember when he first came to the prison? He crushed all the cars. The guards were terrified, because if such a man resisted, I'm afraid that everyone together can hardly stop him. But what we didn't expect was, on this huge body had the face of an angel. The man's name was John. His first question to the warden Paul asked whether the lights were turned off at night because he was afraid of the dark. After he finished, he politely extended his right hand. The kind and friendly John. Paul's instincts told him there must be something else going on here. He pulled up the other man's file. Now he understood what had happened. It turns out that not long ago, 2 daughters of a farming family disappeared. But when the father followed the police to find them, the 2 sisters had fallen into John's arms and were not breathing, and he was holding the 2 bodies and crying. And so John was identified as the murderer. But Paul thought there was something fishy about it, because he'd seen too many sick killers. But John looked different. He was a death row warden, but he believed in goodness. Whenever a prisoner was executed, he would have him taken through the green aisle, because he believed that a death sentence, it meant that the prisoner was about to atone for his sins. No more pain and suffering. Unfortunately, Paul did not get a good deal. He suffered from a severe bladder infection. Every time he went to the bathroom, the pain was so severe that he would sweat. Even in the middle of the night, he would wake up in pain. On this day, another prisoner came to the prison. Don't look at him with a dull face. But when the guards let down their guard, he instantly revealed his true form, strangled a prison guard in one go. Fortunately, his companions rushed to support. This subdued him, and Paul, after this excitement, directly fell to his knees in pain. At that moment, John in the cell called him to come forward. But the next moment, a miracle happened. The prisoner grabbed the guard. Then his hand went underneath him. The inmate screamed with excitement at this sight. But the next moment, something strange happened. The light bulb in the cell got brighter and brighter until it burst. Then John let go of the other guy. He started coughing and coughing. A black worm flew out of his mouth. Then it disappeared into thin air. Paul vaguely felt that something was wrong with his body. He asked John what he had just done. After that he went to bed. Paul went to the bathroom in disbelief. The bladder infection was cured. It was only then that he felt the relief he had never felt before. After this, Paul was even less convinced that the simple John was a murderer. So he approached John's defense attorney to find out more. He realizing that he was a racist, and as a black man, John, naturally, he couldn't get help from the other side. But Paul still had doubts inside. He thanked John. He even bought him a piece of bread. When William saw it, he also wanted to eat it. Paul went up to him and told him to shut up, but he was spit on his face. But Paul did not take it too seriously, but he made it worse. This day, when the prison guards passed by, he grabbed him by the throat and humiliated him with obscene language. He even scared the shit out of him. One of the inmates saw him and kept taunting him. Because this guard is a second-generation official, he relies on his connections to be arrogant and domineering here. Usually, he is always afraid of the weak and the tough, but also often the easiest to hold a grudge. In a few days, it was time for the prisoner's execution. But the second generation of officials still have a grudge about the previous incident. So he deliberately did not wet the sponge and put it on the prisoner's head. After the electricity was turned on, the prisoner did not die at first. Seeing him screaming miserably, the crowd also noticed the anomaly. But it was too late, because now the execution is interrupted. The prisoner will suffer even more. In a few seconds, the prisoner's entire body was smoking. John seemed to feel his pain too, sitting on the bed and trembling. After the execution was over, the colleagues gave the official a good beating, but it did not make him feel the slightest remorse. That day, when Paul was reporting on his work, he learned by accident that the leader's wife had brain cancer. She is now very sick. The first thing Paul thought of was John. In order to cause unnecessary trouble, he took advantage of the night to sneak John out of the prison. The husband watched his wife kissed by another strong man, but he did not do anything to resist. But just then, the wife's mouth began to glow. She began to spit out an unknown substance. The next second, the man sucked it into his body. The house shook with the tremendous energy. In a short time, the woman's physique had recovered as before. The brain tumor that plagued her was completely cured. But this time John was different from before. He didn't spit out the black worm. Afterwards, a weakened John was sent back to prison. Since he hadn't thrown up the black worm, it was as if he was choking on something. It was very uncomfortable. But when the officer passed by, John grabbed him by the hand. Then he spat the black worm in his body into his mouth. Then the second generation lost his mind. He came to William's cell, pulled out a gun and shot him dead. When Paul arrived, he asked John why he did it, but John said in order to punish the bad guys. After he said that, he held out his hand. When Paul took it, he realized everything that happened. It turns out that the real killer of the two sisters is William, and John tried to use his magic power to save them, but found that it was too late. In the end, he was wrongly accused of the murder. But Paul could not justify John after reading it, because no one would believe in miracles. He saw the truth, but John told him not to be upset, that God's work was done. It was time to leave. Before the execution, he asked Paul to take him to see a movie. It was his last wish. Soon it was time for the execution. John asked that he not be hooded, because he was afraid of the dark. The guards shed tears at this. For the first time, they wept for a prisoner. Paul walked up and held John's hand again, just like the way they had first met, as a final goodbye. Then, with tears in his eyes, he gave the execution order. As the electricity passed through John's body, everyone couldn't hold back any longer. The angels had come to save the world, only to find that the place is full of demons. In the end, he left in disappointment, and Paul quit his job. 100 years later, Paul is still alive and healthy, watching the death of his loved ones one by one. He sees it as a divine punishment to make atonement for the angels he had strangled.